Folks, I'm Anne-Marie O'Keefe and I work with the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and we're just delighted to see you in person. Much of our work in recent times it's all been on Zoom, so it's great to see so many faces here this morning, especially on that lovely morning. We have, I suppose before I do anything, I want to say thank you for the space. Aidan, Green, and the team here for sharing this space with us this morning. So I'll get thank you out there straight away before we do anything else. So I don't know if you know much about the centre, and you can see some familiar faces here, so maybe you do know, but I suppose we're more than a think tank, we're a think and do tank. That's frequently what makes us a little bit different. We're based in Armagh, just on the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we're very much focused on the flow across that border region. Much of our work, though, is very much focused on the principles and the promises of the Good Friday Agreement. And very much, and in all of its parts, of course, we're not choosing, we're picking it all because it all needs to work together. It's all about building relationships. It's about fostering collaboration, building capacity for cooperation between the jurisdictions, north, south, and east, west. So very much with Brexit in mind. In recent times, Brexit has really impacted the work of the centre and very much the priorities of the work that we've been doing recently. Anthony, our director, in the centre, in response to Brexit, convened what we call, nice short title, the ad hoc group for North-South, East-West cooperation, a central point for contact with civic society organisations in the region, very much aligned with the work of that ad hoc group is very much aligned with the protocol and that promise to maintain the conditions for cooperation between the jurisdictions, North-South and East-West. So that's very important to us. So today's seminar will explore what the Windsor Framework and the protocol will mean for the practice of institutions of government in Northern Ireland, the relationships that we have with other jurisdictions, other regions, the opportunities and the risks. So we're delighted to have Andrew McCormick with us this morning. You know that Andrew has held many very prestigious high-level positions within the Northern Ireland Civil Service, starting in the 1980s. Sorry for mentioning it, but has certainly worked the whole way up. He has been Director of the Department of Education, Permanent Secretary for the Departments of Health, Social Services and Public Safety, the Department for Enterprise, Trade and Investment, and the Department for the Economy. And more recently, for your sins, in 2018 to 2021, he held the role of Director General for International Relations within the Executive Office with responsibility for EU exit issues. We're also joined today by Michael Darcy, and amongst many other roles, Michael is our Senior Research Associate with the Centre. We're delighted to have him on board. Michael has a wealth of experience and knowledge on the economic and regulatory reform at regional, all-island, EU and international levels. He's been very heavily involved with the development and the thought process behind the all-island economy. And since the UK voted to leave the EU, his work is increasingly focused on protecting that all-island economy and the opportunities there, and highlighting just how much of it helps to underpin peace and protect our Good Friday Belfast Agreement. So in just a moment, Andrew will begin this morning's talk. Michael will now respond. Anthony will then contribute, and we'll have time for question and answers at the very end, and Anthony will close. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand it from to Andrew. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Ross and Anne-Marie, and thanks everyone for being here. It's wonderful to be back with Nuala and the colleagues in this wonderful office. Spent many times here over the years. Indeed, it just occurs to me that the green lane, red lane idea, which lies at the heart of the Windsor Framework, was conceived in this office in October 2017. When we had a visit by, I was part of a delegation led by David Sterling, my boss, the head of the civil service at that time, alongside colleagues from other departments. And we had some very interesting meetings with representatives of the Council Secretariat and the task force. We came away from a very, very challenging meeting with Sabine and Nina in the task force, and sat around the final afternoon of our visit and scratched our heads together. And that's where the idea came from. So that just, well, maybe that's not very well known. Maybe I need to write about that sometime. So it's wonderful to be here. The title implies that we have institutions of government. So I do need to just go a little bit wider than the paper will be published. Anthony will put that on the website at the end of the seminar. So the paper, which you'll see in due course, is quite technocratic, and that's probably what we needed to do, was to examine the mechanics and the substance of how these processes are intended to work, and hopefully they will settle down and work. And I've come away fundamentally thinking that this is a path forward, a fundamentally positive path that can take us to a good place. So much work went into the agreement in February. It's a final settlement from both the UK and EU point of view. There are definite difficulties remaining and complexities that need to be worked through. But fundamentally, if those can be worked through, then the basis for new relationships, the basis for restoration of a positive dynamic is entirely possible. It will require the rebuilding of trust, it will require goodwill, but if people look at these things in a constructive way and build constructively, then to me it's absolutely possible. Just so I will go a little wider, do a little bit of context, and Michael will complement that from both an economic and a historical, a sense of perspective on what the Good Friday Agreement is all about. I think that's very important. Lots of aspects of the arrangements within the island of Ireland, and for Northern Ireland in particular, that are unique. There's no other part of the UK where the constitutional foundations are set in an international agreement, which is the Good Friday Agreement. That's doesn't apply anywhere else, and there are very few jurisdictions where the kind of rights, the kind of respect for identity cross border exist. So for people, I traveled here on an Irish passport. I was brought up very, very directly in the community context I grew up in, to think of myself as British, to identify as British, and there are many who in Northern Ireland who express that in very strong, strident terms. But because I was born in the island of Ireland, I have the right to an Irish passport, and I travelled here on that. So there are probably some parallels in different jurisdictions, but not very many. And that uniqueness, the uniqueness that's at the heart of those relationships, the uniqueness inherent in the Good Friday Agreement, was not understood properly or acted on. Certainly some people talked about it when the referendum happened, but working through the significance of that was deeply neglected, and explains to me a lot of the real difficulties, the wedges that were driven in between UK and Irish governments, the disturbance of an evolving devolution settlement, and to this day, the non-functioning, the fact that the institutions aren't there and aren't working, and there's rumours and hints that they'll be restored, and maybe that'll happen. I hope it does, but it's not guaranteed, and it's not certain. So all that was not reflected properly in the work done by successive administrations after the referendum. Certainly wasn't sufficiently understood or accepted in the Cameron administration. Theresa May faced up to these issues, had to, in the way things evolved, and autumn of 2017 and through 2018. But looking at, for example, Gavin Barbell's book, even to the very end of their administration, they were still hankering after the backstop being temporary or having some unilateral right to withdraw, which to me fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were facing, which was that there needed to be a permanent, workable settlement that resolves the famous Brexit trilemma, which is that for the UK as a departing member state had a choice. Three things on offer, only two could ever be achieved, namely the absence of a hard border on the island of Ireland, the absence of checks and controls on goods moving between the two islands, within the UK from GB to NI, or the third thing they could have was the right to diverge from the single market. Choose any two, but you can't have all three. Fundamental choice, not internalized, not understood in time, not acknowledged. When we sat around that afternoon in October 17, we're trying to see, given those constraints, what's the best available? What's the best functioning, undramatic, tolerable situation? It's not perfection is not available. Perfection wasn't available. For people to say, "Oh, here's something that is fantastic and wonderful," is an exaggeration of truth. To me, the Windsor Framework provides a very good way forward, but to describe it as perfect and simple and reasonable is overselling it. And it's only by drilling down into the detail, working through the detail, and seeing how it works out in practice that we can make it work and find a way for it to function, find a way that respects political interpretations and aspirations across not only within Northern Ireland, but in the rest of Ireland, in the EU, in the UK, to see those things brought together. So how on earth do we get here in that sense? That's interesting timing. We didn't know what was going to happen on Friday night when this date was chosen. But for me, the Johnson government never faced up to the realities of these things and pretended things about the protocol, pretended things about the way it would work, both in 2019 in their determination to be re-elected. It's quite important, I suppose. And in the settlement of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in December 2020. But on both of those occasions, they said that what they had as an agreement was fine. Within months, they were saying not only was it not fine, but it wasn't acceptable. And they tried to reverse it. Back again, denying the trilemma, denying the fact that actually a stable, resolved way of working was needed. And the Windsor Framework is the best attempt to resolve that and make that work that has happened, which is why I come at this fundamentally optimistic that a way of working can be made. Misleading Parliament about parties is very important. Misleading Parliament about what the protocol meant has left a situation where there's no government in Northern Ireland. I would just ask you to reflect on which of those is actually more important in the great scheme of things. So maybe enough political rhetoric. The paper is, as you'll see, is much more technocratic, and so let's look at how this works, how it can be made to work in a way that will facilitate business and the voice of business influencing the way this evolves is really important. So therefore, I think to celebrate the work that the Business Working Group have done, with our organisations. It's very, very significant contribution from people like CCBS in across both thinking and doing about what matters in these issues, raising the issues, explaining the issues, facing up to the facts about these issues. When there's been so much confusion and actually misleading statements coming out of the government, especially, and overselling and overhyping the truth of it. So the position in Northern Ireland, now under the Windsor Framework, people say it was needed because there's a democratic deficit and there's a need for any jurisdiction to have a say in the laws that it's subject to. Now, I just wonder what EEA members would say about that. So there's a fundamental choice being made, which to me is totally legitimate and democratic for any country to say, we will accept being a rule taker because aligning with EU rules is in our economic interests. That's quite a reasonable, legitimate choice. Yes, it's possible that in some case, some evolving EU regulation could be so significantly detrimental from the point of view of, say, Norway or Switzerland. They say, actually, this goes too far. But that becomes a sovereign choice for them to make. Do they stay aligned? Do they retain their entitlement, retain their participation in the single market? They always have the choice of withdrawing from that. That's always a free democratic choice. I would put it to you that for the UK to exercise that same choice in relation to a region of the UK is also democratically legitimate. It's not inherently wrong. There's a case to be made against it, and people have made that case. But that's the way things are, and alignment is the decision that creates what Rishi Sunak called the world's most exciting economic zone. Northern Ireland with dual access to both the EU single market and the UK internal market. And the benefits that can be obtained from that remain very, very significant. The detail of working through how to make that work, the implications of that in detail are worth consideration. So the difference for Northern Ireland is we are a region rather than a member state. So we have a double jeopardy in a certain sense. We have to not only watch, as the EEA members have to watch, the way in which EU regulations evolving and the implications for their economies and their own aspirations as sovereign states to say, well, we'd like to do this way. And is this compatible with the way the EU wants to work? Northern Ireland has also some agency. There's some devolved powers which would enable Northern Ireland to choose to take certain courses, even within the limitations of the UK Internal Market Act. But the big difference is the need to retain awareness of the way in which UK regulation is evolving. And so the two moving parts and the need to be aware of that, understand that. This is where it comes to the work, actual very hard, detailed, technical work for civil servants. That's where it really gets down into considerable technical, complex detail, which will be an immense burden, a very challenging way of working. But if principles are established, if resources are devoted, if there's thought, preparation, and analysis, this is possible. So what's going to happen? The question will always be, how does Northern Ireland adopt and apply evolving EU regulation? The Stormont break, which is at the heart of the Windsor Framework, was presented as the means by which the Northern Ireland institutions can have a say in what happens and how things evolve. and the right to put a hand up and say, we don't like this. So that's the provision that is made. Now, there are two different dimensions to the regulations that the UK government put through, which are interesting because they're both very detailed and very important. I don't see a direct legal link between the two of them. So let's just talk about the two things that are going to be established as a consequence of the Windsor Framework. One is opportunity for scrutiny and analysis. So there will be a new committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly which will have the job of scrutinising evolving EU regulations. Easy when you say it quickly. That's my view is that this will be a much harder task in theory than in practice. I say it because the vast majority of what will be evolving will be complex and detailed, but not controversial. I say that with optimism. I hope that's not over optimism, because obviously the detail of the regulatory world of the relevant oversight of trade in goods is a very complex and challenging field. But the government has provided for a new committee to scrutinise those things, to analyse how is that going to work? What does that depend on? To me, it depends fundamentally on good liaison and good understanding, the building of experience, the building of knowledge, the building of networks. So for me, a very, very significant role and opportunity for this office in this building, for the people here, along with their subject experts back in Belfast, to have the networks, the contacts, the insight to consider what's coming down the tracks. So that's potentially an immense job of work, given the scope and range of regulations that are within the scope of the Windsor Framework. So what do smart operators do in that sense? You maximize your access, you maximize your contacts, you use every possible channel creatively, you build relationships, you get to know the contacts within the Commission, you get to know the contacts in the member state delegations that are most affected, a bit of alliance with Swiss, Norwegian contacts. I make the point because if something actually is going to be very difficult, the kind of regulatory change that will be most likely to cause a problem, and the problem would be something that exacerbates the challenge of moving goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. If either the UK is diverging for some reason or a new regulation is emerging, the most difficult ones are the ones where actually getting traction on what's happening will be the most challenging. Again, this is inference from first principles, based on experience, rather than there's no, I don't see a sort of chart, a sort of guidance map. I can't sort of put in my destination on Google Maps and just follow the directions. I don't think that's the way it's going to be. And if an area is very difficult, then that presumably means there'll be difficulty getting agreement among the 27. And therefore, if something emerges agreed by the 27, saying, actually, well, that's really quite difficult for Northern Ireland, that could be too late. So getting upstream engagement, cliche, but that's to me the absolute key to having any awareness and influence, for seeing what might emerge, therefore for seeing what might be possible to be done ahead of time and moving forward. So that's the scrutiny committee, and they need resources. The departments in Northern Ireland need resources, they need insight, they need real strong leadership in the building and developing of contacts and networks across the place. But I don't see anything in the legislation that says that only if the scrutiny committee says there's a problem can 30 MLAs raise a petition of concern. That's the actual operation of the break. Petition of concern arises when any 30 MLAs, so it does need to be from more than one party, and that's actually currently inherent in the makeup of the assembly, can say we are not happy with this change and require consideration of it. So that's not, I don't see the legislation saying that can only happen when the scrutiny committee says there's a problem. Obviously, the more evidence that there is, then the more chance the issue actually does meet the criteria that are laid down. And the regulations, both the agreement between the UK and the EU and the implementing regulations, emphasize the criteria that any problematic issue needs to meet to be eligible. So that's important. But that's the mechanics. The mechanics are there. There's a need for scrutiny and there's a need for political consideration. So therefore, as I draw in the paper, then there are a number of considerations that we need to think about going forwards and be aware of from both a technocratic and a political point of view. So points would be these. Will the scope for raising concerns be honoured faithfully? Or will it be played tactically? I look back over many years of experience working with the Northern Ireland institutions. The scope for tactical creativity is there. And that has both led to problems, very occasionally led to solutions, but it's an important dimension of how things work. And we need to be aware of it and thoughtful about it. Secondly, there's the question as to will the UK behave in good faith, because the storm break only applies if the UK accepts the judgment that the consequences of adopting the amended EU regulation do meet the criteria, as in consequences for making a significant difference, a significant impact specific to the everyday life of communities in Northern Ireland in a way that is likely to persist. These are high criteria, but yet government ministers have said, oh, if Stormont says so, the UK would have to follow that. Well, that may be what you want to do politically, but that test is there as well. You as UK government have a responsibility to judge, does this or does this not meet the criteria? And presumably that's subject to challenge and review in various legal mechanisms. But even saying those things shows that we've got a difficulty. If you're back into a place of confrontation and distrust, then something's not working. Far better to get upstream, to look at these issues, to understand what's coming, try to find a way to resolve them in advance through constructive dialogue and engagement, to steer around rather than take something head on. I say that in the hope that that can apply to the vast majority of updating and emerging regulations where it will just make sense to stay in line, and maybe the UK will in fact stay in line itself in lots of ways. But the possibility of there being something where there is a risk of detriment that needs to be seen and thought about as long as possible, as far away in advance as possible. And the question, obviously, at the back of all of this is the propensity of the UK to diverge from EU regulations. That's been at the heart of the whole debate from 2016 onwards, and you don't see that much detail and sense coming out of London on that issue all the way through those years. Lots of rhetoric, but we will see what happens in the years ahead. Also important to emphasize that the Windsor Framework confirmed text of the protocol makes specific provision for North-South cooperation and for the access of the North-South institutions as part of the Good Friday Agreement to make representations, to draw issues to attention. There's a specific defined role for NSMC, for the North-South implementation bodies. And this is again where CCBS can play its constructive part in working and advising, liaising, building relationships, because again, understanding these things and maximizing that opportunity has significance. I guess, come back to the point in a way. I was going to say needle in the haystack, but rather than use the cliched metaphor, if you think of EU regulations as a vast vat of berries, and there's one or two in there that are poisonous. That's in a way what the task would be. It'll be identifying where is there something which could cause dislocation, real difficulty, and seeing that as early as possible, identifying what can be done about it. That's where it stands. So those are the thoughts and considerations that I've tried to draw out in the paper, and happy to get into further discussion on these things as to how the mechanics work. Just a few wider thoughts. Come back to the view that the framework is the best available option. I think it was significantly oversold on the day it was announced, and that's partly why unionists have reacted to it, because when they read the rhetorical statements that were made about as if it completely removed all of their objections, almost back to Brandon Lewis's horrible messages back at around the point of exit, when he said that there will be no Irish sea border. That was a grotesque misrepresentation. Yes, the green line, red line idea. Yes, the detailed application of the Windsor Framework vastly de-dramatizes the position. For me, it was a more movement than I expected from the EU in opening things up, in making things possible, adopting a risk-based approach, because what Sabine said to us that day in October 2017 was that on agri-food goods, on SPS, health-related issues, the EU's risk appetite was zero. And I guess DG Sante often get portrayed as the most difficult part of the negotiation mechanism. Just would venture the thought that if a bunch of civil servants were acting in a way that was protecting my health, I'd quite like them to be rigorous. I don't think that's inappropriate. So have we got a solution? The fact of some provision within the Windsor Framework for agri-food goods to be in the green lane, that to me was a very, very significant step, a step towards what we talked about that day, a risk-based approach. So the Windsor Framework adopts a risk-based approach, which then, what strikes me about that, it has the capacity to evolve with experience. Every governance-based system not only looks at the actual theoretical risks, it looks at how things are working out in practice. And that's why, to me, there's scope for how this thing works to evolve constructively and creatively. I'm determinedly optimistic. One of my colleagues in the health department was describing himself as pathologically optimistic. I do think that the UK government has made a firm choice, and have, in adopting this, have crystallized finally their choice in relation to the trilemma, because the alternative courses of action they could have taken would have led either to enduring and grotesque difficulty with the EU, if they persist with the protocol bill and that confrontational approach, that was a very, very difficult course. Committing to a high alignment outcome, as Theresa May was clearly doing, would not have been deliverable for the UK government in February. They've chosen the third option. They must have known that that risked the continuation of difficulty politically in Northern Ireland. But from their point of view, it still strikes me as a rational enough choice. If they really believed that what they were saying was going to, especially with the presentational aspect of Windsor and all the resonances of that, and the very blatant incentive that says the storm break thing only works if you come back into government. That was a blatant short-term tactic. Did they really believe unionists would buy that? Maybe they did, but it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened yet, and that to me is why the need for serious, candid, honest discussion now continually matters. The UK government have said some things explicitly, as in, no, there will not be a hard border, as in, there will not be a renegotiation of the Windsor Framework. There's no scope. This is it. And end point reached. They've said those things. What they haven't said explicitly is that that means that some of the things that the DUP are saying cannot be done. They're just not possible. So the rhetoric, every time we hear a DUP representative saying why they're not in government, they say, we were promised the restoration of Northern Ireland's place in the internal market. The Windsor Framework is the best available participation of Northern Ireland in the UK internal market. There's nothing better available. I haven't heard a UK government minister saying back to the DUP, no, we didn't promise you that. We did promise you this, and we've delivered this. This is what we have delivered, and it's yes, still got some difficulties. It does mean some constraints. It does mean some impediments to the flow of goods from GB to MI, but that's the deal that we've done. No better deal is available. Anything, if you go back to a different set of principles, then any model would be vastly worse. Anything that the land border is erected as if that was only a political risk. So they try to say, some unions try to say, oh, if it's so hard to have a camera on the land border, why do you have to? Is that not just as bad as, or checks at the ports of Northern Ireland not just as bad as that? Well, maybe from a point of view of constitutional principle, you can draw an equivalence, but from the point of view of practical reality, you just can't. The degree of dislocation, the practical as well as the political consequences mean that the consistent decision to stand against a land border is absolutely rational. And again, some of these things just need to be spelled out. James Cleverly, Chris Heaton-Harris have said some of these things, but not, from my point of view, as clearly, as starkly to say, maybe they're saying it privately to the DUP, this is the way it works, because we have the absence of government in Northern Ireland, primarily, from my point of view, because of lack of honesty and candor from London, explaining what this means, explaining what was happening. Instead, hype and overselling, as happened to some degree in February. So that's the missing part for me. It stands against the operation of these institutions, but I believe that will be overcome, and that as we work through this, when we deal with these points technically and get into these details, it can be made to work. It depends on trust, goodwill, faithful operation. It'll mean an awful lot of work for civil servants. That's the way it goes, but that's the issues are inherently complicated. So better to face up to that, work it through, and those are my thoughts. Those are my thoughts as to how this works, and look forward to what Michael has to say in response and comment on, and he will add some additional perspectives and look forward to a conversation afterwards. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Anthony, for the opportunity to do this and follow that. So I think that Andrew has given us a really seriously considered, thoughtful, and quite illuminating reflection on the Windsor Framework as agreed, excuse me, a few months ago. So I hope that all those with a responsibility and a capacity to implement its provisions, and at least those provisions that he focused on today, will do so with due purpose. I have to tell you also, to add to this, that Andrew is a very organized person. When he sent me his paper 2 weeks ago, and I was the respondent, I said to myself, that'll take about 2 minutes and I'll be finished, because there's so little in it to respond to. The only additional illumination I will add, if I may, is I can understand how, from a Belfast perspective, the phrase, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are not working, has traction. However, I would argue from a Dublin perspective, that is simply not the case. In a Northern Ireland context, the principles and spirit of the agreement is working, which is to replace the pursuit of political ends by non-democratic means, has ended. Why? Because normal politics, as we understand it, and all of you in this room, apart from those of us who lived through the Troubles, understand that local elections, assemblies being elected, parties fighting it out, putting their vision forward, depending on the ballot box to deliver that, is normal politics. What we had for 30 years, the Trouble, was abnormal politics, where the primacy of political violence held sway. And that's what the Good Friday Agreement has ended. So yes, there isn't a Northern Ireland executive, but everyone has the anticipation there will be. That's had a knock-on effect on the operation of the North-South Ministerial Council, but there's still a joint secretariat sitting, doing its work quietly in the background, preparing for there being an assembly in place and consequently the restoration of its council meetings. The cross-border bodies are still working that are set up under the agreement, including Intertrade Ireland as promoting trade and commerce across the border, and particularly the SEUPB, the Special EU Programs Body. Full declaration, I'm on its Programme Monitoring Committee with the Peace Plus programme that we've just launched, that's funded by the EU, the British government, and the Irish government to the tune of €1.4 billion for peace projects that are cross-border projects. And three, most importantly, though it'll hardly get a mention today, are the Strand 3 institutions. The British Irish Council, the Secretariat of which sits in Edinburgh, that continues to function and have meetings, and particularly the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference, that had gone very quiet for a long time, but has recently been reactivated. And I noted that the British Prime Minister attended the most recent meeting. So I would argue that from a broader perspective, the agreement is working in many important ways towards what its ultimate objective was. So I'm going to take an equivalent task for a different aspect of what Andrew is talking about. In his paper, which you read, I hope, he mentions specifically in the North-South dimension this: specific opportunities for the North-South institutions to contribute to the work of the Joint Committee and the Specialised Committee on the application and operation of protocol, and these provisions are not amended in the Windsor Framework. So what are these specific opportunities? Well, first of all, there is half a map. There is a map, I would argue, for what I would call the Belfast or the Northern Ireland, Ireland of Ireland, EU road to Brussels. It's a very well-developed map and has a very efficient, organised and effective operating machinery that's multi-purposed and covers the broad spectrum of EU operation. And part of my response will be to outline some of the areas, therefore, there's help for the Scrutiny Committee and the other actors in Northern Ireland in regard to this particular parallel route to Brussels, if I may put it that way. But what's the most important thing? This is the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. There's been a lot of celebrations right of its success to date in helping to bring about peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland. So I said, well, maybe the best way I can offer response is to pose a question. And the question I decided to pose was, to mark its 25th anniversary, there has been renewed high-level political commitments to support peace and prosperity underpinned by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But how might this be achieved for the island of Ireland and the all-island economy with the support of the Windsor Framework? Question. Now, my sense is, and I've checked this out, not a lot of thought and consideration has been given to this to date, because naturally and rightly everyone's been focused on the immediate issues that have arisen since the original Northern Ireland Protocol was signed. So I make no claim to in any way providing answers. I just perhaps want to be a catalyst to get people in this room who clearly are very interested in thinking about what those answers are, and perhaps provide a few initial thoughts to seed those conversations, okay? And in doing so, and it's really important, I'll be guided Andrew's wise words in the paper, which he concluded with goodwill, earned trust, common sense, and a proportionate approach, the Windsor Framework can be made to work. I think that's really, really important. Those of you who've been involved know this is it, my original early edition. And it was originally called Agreement Reached in the Multi-Party Negotiations, funnily enough, but it seems no one liked that title. I always liked it because multi-party negotiations is what it was about. And imagine it's just 35 pages in English and Irish, by the way, so it'll be even shorter in one of those languages only. And it did end 30 years of the Troubles. 3,700 people died, 47,000 injured. The highest loss in any one day was actually in the Republic. 33 people killed, 300 injured. So that's important. That was the greatest, longest, a continual sequence of the attempt to use large-scale political violence to influence political decisions in the United Kingdom or the European Union. Not to be forgotten. So what the agreement is about is tackling that, and it has done. And I think it's useful, the language of the agreement. One of the concerns me is the language of the agreement will somehow be beheaded by the framework, because so much of the framework has been about the technicalities of goods and the movement of goods and customs. And customs have to be so precise in everything. Every word means something, because every word describes a good, and there are a lot of goods. The agreement, on the other hand, had a complexity. The complexity of what could be possible. And that needs a certain amount of, how shall we say, constructive ambiguity was the word, I think, at the time that was used by those brilliant diplomats and who were very much behind the creation of the agreement. So one of the first thing I want to propose to you is some of the words of the agreement need a bit of reworking into this new challenge. Words such as reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust implemented by commitment to partnership, equality, and mutual respect. Words such as the political parties would endeavour to strive in every practical way towards reconciliation and rapprochement within the framework of democratic and agreed arrangements. Now that includes all political parties, even those who only signed up subsequently as a consequence of another agreement. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, they committed to work in good faith to ensure the success of each and every arrangement of the agreement, accepting that all of the institutional and constitutional arrangements are interlocking and interdependent. I think it's fair to say that originally those of us who were around, and I wasn't directly involved, I was only involved in the economic research and business interaction that was leading up to the agreement. I wasn't in the room, I wasn't part of the teams, but we very much fed our research into the process in order to help to scope out the prosperity piece, when naturally most of the attention was on the political and the peace dimension. But really, we hope that that interlocking dimension will be a positive that would lift everybody up. Unfortunately, as we would discover subsequently, too often it was used as a means to stop, to slow down, to create obstacles. So one of my first fears I'd share with you is that in the Windsor Framework context, again, that interlocking dimension will slow down, be an obstacle, and take away the possibility of what might be, rather than add to what can be and create those possibilities, okay? Because, you know, ensuring the success of each and every arrangement applies to the Windsor Framework, to the to as great a degree as to the Good Friday Agreement, because one now cannot work without the other. That's simply a political, regulatory, and dare I say, constitutional fact. So as we're in Brussels, and as I'm going to address the other side, which is the European dimension side, what does that mean for the EU? Well, I'm going to take the words of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the Queen's University Agreement 25 conference, which Andrew and I both had the pleasure and honour to attend, when she spoke in the final session that featured the UK Prime Minister, President Bill Clinton. It would definitely have been the current president if it wasn't for one of the political parties. Mayor Šefčovič, the Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, and Council President Charles Michel. I should, for those of you who weren't watching it live, by the way, only 2 of those speakers got standing ovations, and one of them was Ursula von der Leyen. You'll have no problem guessing who the other was. In that speech, I have 3 selected quotes, and again, I urge any of you who didn't pick it up at the time to read it. She said, "This is an opportunity to thank and praise the architects of the Good Friday Agreement. Wholly justified. Architecture is about building something somewhere where you can't see what can exist." Really important. But also to look at our friendship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and most importantly, to look at the future of peace in Northern Ireland. Again, I'm just injecting that peace dimension into the European Union's considerations. It's a high-level strategic project for the European Union, a peace project, first and foremost. In this current environment, surely we don't need to be reminded about the importance of peace projects. Violence, when it begins, has to be ended. When it's carried out by a state actor or a non-state actor, it has to be ended too. Somehow, some way, sometime, by agreement. She went on to say, the Windsor Framework is a new beginning for old friends. Turns the pages on years of division and dispute. Well, so did the Belfast Agreement. It is an opportunity to set our sights on the future of our partnership and to focus on what brings us together. Again, I'm fearful that negotiations, which are naturally 2 counterpositions, are put and you have to come to some conclusion as a compromise, will dominate as they have thinking, instead of standing back and saying, what can we do on a combined, collective, positive basis to make things that aren't now being considered possible that would also be constructive and helpful to the process. And finally, I'd like to quote her saying, I can reassure you that we in the European Union will continue to do our part to accompany you on the path of peace and prosperity. And then she referred to grandchildren. Full disclosure interest, I'm now a grandfather, believe it or not. Expecting, if all goes to plan, 4 granddaughters under 4 by the end of July. My prospects for staying on this pitch full time in the future are perhaps looking somewhat a little less certain than I thought they might be. Anyhow, so myself and the fellow grandparent, Commission President von der Leyen, said, my grandchildren are toddlers. What Northern Ireland and the whole of the island of Ireland will look like when they are in their 20s depends on all of us. And I'm presuming she meant the institutions, the Commission, those who interact with them, those who work with them, those who advise them, and not just everyone in the room in Queen's that day. Speaking of the same event, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, of course, reaffirmed Ireland's support. And of course, he spoke particularly about the partnership with the United Kingdom. He quoted the British Prime Minister saying, the agreement was born of partnership. And again, I just highlight, over here we have negotiations, over here we have partnership. Certainly, partnerships are perhaps a negotiation. I know, long time, 43 years married, but they take place in a context of firm, shared commitment. Negotiations around trade and business can come from a different direction with 2 sides having different sectional interests. To me, there's a balance to be struck between these 2 that I fear is not necessarily there at the moment. He also said, and I think we as co-guarantees agreement will be here every step of the way, which I take as the Irish government's commitment to everything that Ursula von der Leyen was talking about. So you have to look at the fact that if you want to embed peace, if you want to enable prosperity in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland as a whole, it's always needed a relentless focus on the future of what's possible and not just protecting the past as manifest today. Because once upon a time, today wasn't deemed possible either. So that's the kind of, dare I say, the Good Friday Agreement, 25-year strategic, broader policy picture. Just as I say, I'm just general sketching. You're the experts in all this stuff. Now, you're the guys who are going to have to take it forward. When I look at all your youthful faces, my goodness, don't be afraid of being here still in 2050. If I take the same perspective with Andrew and having been around here in the 1980s myself. So now to move on to the economic and the broader, what are we talking about? What are the opportunities? What are the Pacifics? Well, just to remind you, of course, there is the mapping exercise undertaken by the UK and the EU on North-South cooperation that identified 145 items at least of shared interests that I haven't heard much spoken about since. There is key elements like the all-island energy market, the single electricity market. Energy is on the table for the EU and the UK negotiations generally, but there's a very specific and particular part of it that is the island of Ireland, its interconnectivity with Britain, connectivity with the continent. That is central to the Good Friday Agreement successes. Absolutely, it keeps the lights on in every house in Ireland and would not have been possible without the agreement. Full stop. Okay, there is the commitment in Article 11 and the various other areas to maintain the conditions for North-South cooperation, and the CCBS and Anthony and Deirdre have been doing so much important work on that, right? But you can't maintain today's conditions if you don't think about the future and how the future is going to unfold in order to maintain them today. I think that that's really important. Then there's the all-island labour market. Again, Articles 2 and 3 of the original protocol, which no one speaks about, was absolutely essential. Free movement of people across the border, even if it's only Irish and British citizens. Imagine, here's the counterfactual. Imagine celebrating the 25th anniversary and thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of people march to border posts to demand free movement across the border, instead of the checks that were implemented because this common travel area was ignored, because there isn't an Article 2 and 3 in the protocol. Inconceivable, you say? Well, thankfully, yes, inconceivable. And that's a testimony to the success of the agreement. It survived perhaps its biggest tests to date in coming through the period that we've experienced since 2016 now. So maybe so that's the other thing, success. Like, I want to suggest that this framework, or perhaps the Northern Ireland Pass, have posted a dramatic success in the context of economics, and especially the all-island economy. So that's what I was meant to talk about, forget that. So this chart here, this chart was used by the CEO of IBEC, Danny McCoy, who last week in Belfast for the Sir George Quigley Memorial Lecture used this chart. Sir George Quigley was the man who conceived the future in a way no one thought possible. 1992, he spoke about an island economy, 2 years before the ceasefires, 6 years before the Good Friday Agreement, a decade and a half before security barriers were taken down and there was actual free movement across the border. So if economics and the all-island economy was a virus, dare I say, this was its March 2020 moment. Okay. Now, actually, I think there's a degree of under-accounting from particularly 2010, 2011, when the idea of the economy really embedded in the north. The South's economy began to recover more quickly, particularly productive economy, than people at the time realized. And businesses in the north who are really interested in development understood this, realized this, and started to take those opportunities. But of course, in the single market, there was no need to report what they were doing to the government. Therefore, the government didn't collect it. Therefore, the government hadn't data. Therefore, the government didn't believe it. Well, guys, it's true now. Okay. So this is what it's about. This is the opportunity for Northern Ireland, for the island of Ireland, for the European Union and the United Kingdom. And just to illustrate, if way back in 1990, anytime from 1970 to 1990, you talked about going to Northern Ireland, or many to the island of Ireland for tourism, for a visit, any risk of getting shot, finding a bomb? No, I'm not going there. Look what happened, of course, after the ceasefires. They began to build. Yes, the Republic has leveraged out, perhaps taken full advantage of it, but Northern Ireland has taken advantage as well. Tourism Ireland, and cross-border body set up under the Good Friday Agreement has promoted this internationally. I also like this chart, which Danny used last Thursday, because, and I'm on record as saying this, in the previous George Quigley lecture, the Republic has banked the majority of the prosperity dividend. And this illustrates it, right? Now, fair dues to us, I'd say. Northern Ireland perhaps hasn't made the economic decisions it needed to make in order to do so. And there's reports the SRI produced on productivity and the fall of productivity in the North that tend to point to that. But there's still unrealized potential in both jurisdictions, which needs the work of the Windsor Framework in its totality, to pick up that word of the agreement, the totality of relationships with critical language in the agreement in order to pick up. But how does this matter to ordinary people in their lives? This is the third chart that Danny used, life expectancy at birth. Quite dramatic change from 2012, 2011, 2012. Quite a gap opening up between the Republic, the UK as a whole, and Northern Ireland. Life expectancy is declining in Northern Ireland. That's up to 2017. No reason to believe the trend has been reversed since. Fundamental, really important. So, what would the economists say about all of this? Well, thankfully, I'm not an economist, but I understand what they will say is that because Northern Ireland now, for the productive dimension of the Northern Ireland economy, the Republic of Ireland, oh, did I go? Oh, no, hold on a minute, I have to come to that. The productive dimension of the Northern Ireland economy is now significantly engaged with the Republic and consequently with the EU. So Northern Ireland's economy is benefiting seriously from those economic interactions, and the potential for Northern Ireland to grow, therefore, needs that dimension of their economy to grow. And this is particularly important for SMEs in the border region, which of course was always the case. If you're in Derry, your nearest market is Donegal, full stop. That's it. Likewise, Newry, particularly the Belfast-Dublin corridor, Derry, Donegal, Galway, Limerick, the Atlantic corridor, Midland, all of those corridors are important, and potential for development still goes. Food and beverage, supply chains, using indigenous products, leveraging economies of scale, proximity, and conditions that Sir George Quigley highlighted all those years ago. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of opportunities there. The NSMC has a role under Article 17 of the North-South of Strand 2 of the agreement. It has the possibility to have a role in the consultation matters relating to EU affairs. That's why it also has a place in the General Committee, specialized committee, that all of which Andrew outlines in his paper. So from an economic perspective, Northern Ireland wants the best of both worlds. It has to take seriously both worlds, interact with both worlds, and be responsible to both worlds. That's the world of the track from Northern Ireland, GB, EU, Northern Ireland, Island of Ireland, EU. Just doing one will be suboptimal. That's just a fact. Not doing both certainly won't be beneficial for Northern Ireland. So, and that will require both the UK and EU systems to engage with their efforts fully, constructively, and hopefully progressively. So, where is their help? Well, the Irish government, if I may start with the Irish government, is fundamentally in a position to do so. It's a member state. It's involved in all the European Union's operations. It's at every meeting, at every table, no official, etc. So I was kind of thinking, what's a practical proposal? Maybe we could have some sort of a clearinghouse under the NSMC, which allowed an information exchange between the officials in the north and the south, etc. You know, it could be reported back what's happening here. It's not necessarily relevant, but it's still among the top three of any Irish government official in any EU forum as to look out for. Is there a potential wider implication, either within the framework itself or for wider matters covered by the agreement? That's one possibility. NSMC I mentioned, Irish MEPs, Commissioner Mairead McGuinness, I know her a long time. She comes from a border region. She's a full understanding of this. Commissioner Seshkovic is, to say the least, well up to speed. The Dáil, I noticed that MLAs, that's members of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland, participate in meetings, the Good Friday Agreement Committee. But why not the European Affairs Committee, the Oireachtas as well? So is there part and parcel of that scrutiny possibility? Agencies of the Irish government, all of these agencies have interactions with Europe in different ways. Some have Pacific North-South responsibilities. All have a responsibility for the island of Ireland. and they should be as aware of that responsibility as they are of their domestic responsibilities. In the economic community, IBEC, in full disclosure here, I do a lot of work with IBEC, with the Joint Business Council, with Northern Ireland Business. In fact, the JBC was one of the conduits for, as Andrew knows, for information sharing during the Brexit negotiations as regards to how business in Northern Ireland would be impacted depending on the outcome of the negotiations. They have an office here in Brussels. Their sectoral organizations are involved with various food and drink, like Food and Drink Europe, various organizations here. IBEC Global interacts with the rest of the world in Ireland, and they're here since the beginning of the EEC, along with the IFA and the cooperative organizations, NGOs, Chambers Ireland. I could go through a multitude, but they are established channels for understanding, interacting with, and influencing what happens in Brussels, what decisions are taken. And on the question of influencing, I said this to Andrew, and he gave me a wry smile. From a private sector perspective, lobbying in Brussels is the champion league of lobbying. It's more complicated, more sophisticated, and there's a hell of a lot more going on all the time. So only the most skillful players, all you folks here, can actually effectively engage with it, and that tends to be the most expensive, hence the Champions League reference. But it does mean you can log in and should log into the official channels, but you need to have something to say. If you're a business, if you're a business representative organization, NGO, whatever, you have to have something to say, and what you say has to be relevant to the decision-making processes, and you have to therefore understand them and know how they work and how to actually interact with them, and that's very expensive. So to conclude, I was going to show you a few more maps. So recently, there's a very comprehensive report done by the Committee of the Regions of the European Parliament on what future for North-South cooperation. So how do you measure the cost of not having cooperation? So I brought this up. We're all talking about public transport and rail networks. Now, they include some of these maps in their report. I say IBEC produced them in a 2015 report with the Joint Business Council in Northern Ireland. This was the rail network in 1920. That's the definition of all island connectivity. Declan, do you like this map? I saw you looking at it. Come here, before you go, let me show you what it was. That was in 1990. Look at the effect of the border. Look at how a whole region of Ireland was denied its connectivity as a result, right? Look at this map. This was the road network, 1729 to 1739, right? See this is the motorway network today. Look at that. Look at the effect of the border. The whole north of the island, virtually, denied. And by the way, the Northern Ireland motorway was built in 1968. It's the last full motorway built in Northern Ireland, right? That's why that's a comprehensive, modern, all-island transport network, okay? So I've done it. I conclude, finally, with what President van der Leyen said in Belfast. The ultimate choice lies with you, the people of Northern Ireland, to shape your history and that of the next generation. The gateway to a bright future is open. All you need to do is walk through it. I would suggest when you walk through it, there are two paths, but they know both need to be taken simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Andrew, for those excellent presentations. Obviously, Michael following on from Andrew's presentation. We'll take a few minutes for questions. Doesn't have to be questions. It can be comments, reactions, inputs, whatever you would like. But I just like to begin. Sorry, I forgot to reintroduce myself. I'm Anthony Suarez. I'm the director of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and I do want to pick up on a couple of things. So in our role, this ad hoc group for North, South and East West cooperation, longest title ever, this group that we convene, which really is making every effort to make sure that the necessary conditions are maintained for North-South cooperation, but we also look at East-West cooperation, bringing together a whole range of organisations from the two jurisdictions from the island of Ireland. And we do interact, have meetings with the specialised committee on the protocol, two separate sides, Commission side UK government side, separate meetings then with UK government. Unfortunately, we don't have a Northern Ireland government to engage with. We engage with the Irish government as well. But it is this effort, this work. And Andrew was pointing out about the work that needs to be done in order to ensure that we make the most of the Windsor Framework. So the Northern Ireland Assembly will have its work cut out for it to make sure it does exploit those opportunities. The Northern Ireland Civil Service, business, civic society, we have our work cut out for us. And it's a lot of work. It already is a lot of work. And I have to say, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, we're kind of used to it. Because just the nature of what we do means we always have to keep an eye on what pre-Brexit, what's coming out of Brussels, what's coming out of London, what's coming out of Dublin, what's coming out of Belfast whenever Stormont is operating, what comes out of Scotland or comes out of Wales. I think we also have to emphasize that even in this new context, there are other devolved administrations in the UK, the Scottish and the Welsh governments, so we have to keep an eye on what's happening there. So there is a lot of work to do. But it's also, and Michael's emphasizing their partnership. It is working together for a shared goal, a shared objective. I think that is really, really important. We, as the centre and also the ad hoc group, we noted, we welcomed the Windsor Framework, but essentially one of the most important things was the Windsor Framework marked an absolute sea change in relations between the UK government and the European Union. It is a positive thing, but that positivity has to be maintained, and it takes both sides to maintain that positive relationship. So I really do hope that both the Commission and the UK government keep an eye on their language and the way that they interact with each other, and we don't go back to a kind of negotiation position where we're competing against each other. It really takes a lot of care. So that I just want to make those 2 points. So I'd just like to open it up for any questions, comments from anybody, and don't be shy. Are we all illuminated?
One silence, with Andrew, aren't we some there?
What?
Can I just
Yeah.
comment? It's more a comment. It's not really a question. Much of the narrative that we hear on the radio and on the news, all the rest of it, it's quite negative. So the contributions here today, it's so positive and feels like something that can actually work well with the tinkering and with the necessary hard work that's required. But it's a different story to what we're being fed, I suppose. So just that comment out there, the positivity is appreciated.
Maybe this question, because Andrew, you mentioned the work has to happen. You mentioned that need to be upstream instead of us, especially in terms of the Northern Ireland Assembly. We don't want to be in a position where we're dealing with problems. We want to be actually upstream, making sure that we're involved in conversations, in discussions, not necessarily shaping directly. We are a third country. We're not within the EU, but involved in conversations so that we avoid that problems coming to the Assembly. But you also mentioned resourcing. Resourcing of the Northern Ireland Civil Service in terms of what we have to do back at home. But this office, maybe you want to say a couple more words about the importance of this particular place that we're in today.
Yes, so I was reflecting with Michael earlier, the origins of this office go back to over 20 years ago when David Trimble and Seamus Fallon were respectively First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Their advisors were very determined to establish a presence and to build relationships, and so that the office has been here since then. And to me, like many, I think with part of the value that's always been there is not only liaising with the institutions of the EU itself, but also with partner regions. We've had excellent working relationships with a number of regions, Germany, other countries. And that's part of the investments. Also the EEA members, Swiss and all regions. That's part of how it works. Part of the investment as needed now is to have a good expert team here. Not a small number of people here, obviously, as in any delegation, can't be the subject experts in everything, but they have to know the way around and know who to draw on in the subject matter experts in the departments Belfast. And therefore, they're building out what makes seeing that as something really worth investing in. To me, is critically important at the present time. It's just slight political awkwardness, which I touch on in the paper, which is that part of the mythology of fear that's around is that the Windsor Framework draws Northern Ireland into the EU's orbit, and that's part of an agenda towards increasing the dominance of the North-South relationship over the relationship with the rest of the EU, the rest of the UK. So there'll be, if and when the institutions are back, it's possible that some of the ministers might be reluctant to depend too much on Dublin for information and advice. That's not to say it wouldn't be a very, very good thing. Everything Michael said from that point is very constructive and needs to be developed and explored. It's just to be aware that there'll be some politicians in Northern Ireland will look at that with care, and so therefore for the office to run a job day and daily is to be balanced, to be seen to be balanced. You know, if the head of the civil service travels with the First Minister, and with every First Minister has to spend exactly equal time with both of them. That's just part of the way power sharing. It's not the text they don't, but it's inherent in the practical operation of these relationships. So they have to be fair and balanced. And that's the perception that got out of balance is part of why we end up with a problem. Needs work done.
In fairness, it'll be hard to maintain that sense of balance in a Brussels perspective, because it's kind of like counterintuitive, but actually Northern Ireland's presence is disproportionate to the rest of the UK because it has a connectivity to the EU, whereas the UK as a whole is a third country. And that's going to be difficult. And like, I don't think as a player more than just the theory, but the practice. You know what I mean? So somehow the op is going to keep it on the field. Yeah, exactly. Is what happens on the field. Or more particularly, I was also going to mention networking. What happens after? Because one of the great resources of, dare I say, the Irish in Brussels has been network. And usually the totality of the community used to in the old days we found in a small number of selected refreshment houses, otherwise known as pubs. And a lot of the real work tended to be done there, right? Because you're just both Northern Ireland are just a very small fraction of the totality of activity in the community and the totality of interest. So the shared interest,
yes,
in a Brussels perspective, right, leans more towards the Dublin. In a London, if those same officials find themselves in London having the same discussion, then clearly it'll lean in to the UK perspective, right? So I just think, again, to the Northern Ireland office here, that it's really important that its potential interaction directly with the Commission institution is fully understood, both by the UK itself and then by the Irish permanent representation and the other Irish organizations like IBEC, etc., in their on behalf of business in Brussels, right? Because that's the way to max out, in my view, on the possibilities of working the framework positively and leveraging the full potential of all the channels that are already there on a day and won't go away of Ireland as a member state's full commitment to all dimensions of the European Union, including its external relationships with the EEA, Norway that you mentioned earlier, etc. Okay, so that would be, to me, it's horse which pitch you're playing on, like which ground are you in, away, whatever, away game, whatever. It's very great degree of flexibility going to be required here, and that's why it's such a skillful and demanding game.
There's actually quite a few pitches to play on.
Yeah.
And
Oh, don't forget Armagh.
yes, exactly. But I think it's also important in terms of, and you were talking about, you know, the difficulty that perhaps from certain political parties in terms of that kind of north-south dimension. But we mustn't forget that the Good Friday Agreement, it's the North-South Ministerial Council, which still has that responsibility for the two administrations to discuss EU policy. It remains unchanged. So there's the channel. The British Irish Council, Strand 3, that's where you have Irish, Northern Ireland administration, Scottish, Welsh, and the UK government all present, where again you have those discussions, and that can kind of balance things out a bit. But it's maximizing all of those channels and being present there and having a voice. Unfortunately, for the last while, we haven't had a voice. In fact, we haven't had a voice at the most critical period that has faced Northern Ireland, but for so many years, there has been no voice there in terms of a Northern Ireland executive, but hopefully we'll be able to get back to that one soon. So, hooray!
Some type from the national delegation coordinator with Committee Regions for Ireland. And Mike, you mentioned the COR earlier, but I was wondering, Andrew, what role you see for local government on both sides of the border to ensure the success of the Windsor Framework?
So again, the part of the success of the institutions that local government never suspended itself. They've never said, "Oh, we can't agree how to be government." They've just gone on with it. And again, I've worked with many colleagues in local government in their different aspects of representation here, and with commission-led or EU-led activities. So the scope is strong, and I agree that's something that's well worth developing. They have the local government has less power. The scope of functions is narrower than in most jurisdictions, but nevertheless there's some important aspects of the way this works, including actually aspects of the operation of the checks and balances in the courts. So some of those are local government responsibility in relation to how this works. So therefore, to maximize the contribution and the understanding, and actually that's both practically beneficial, but also means that there's a place where local councillors from the range of parties who operate aspects of power sharing. There's a de facto power sharing in most of the councils because they're not under any particular control. That means there's a dynamic that it's just getting on with stuff, practically working instance through, which to me is absolutely following forward. So and their representation previously through the regions, the engagement there is a legacy that is beneficial there, which we can use and develop those representation functions. Very, very good to know.
I know that Caroline Freeman, who led your study with Katie Hayward in the ICLRD, which go back to the agreement as well, helped them sort of one of the models for this is Jerry Strabane and Donegal, for what I call the geographic northwest, the island of Ireland. So it's the Northwest Road Partnership that they formed with each other, with the two local authorities from Mission to Boston, East Coast of the United States, but for some reason they feel closer to perhaps than other parts of Europe, maybe geography again. But I think that that's really very good. And then also Peace Plus is a merger of the original Peace Program and Interreg, and local authorities are very active in the Peace Program, both sides of the border forming joint project to take advantage of money that's subsumed into the Peace Plus program. So they will continue to work together. I think the real question is I think this report is an excellent way to start. How can the Committee of the Regions help them to understand? Because taking up another point about education to understand how to work the system. So I think it was excellent that your committee reached out to create this report, so that now there's practical evidential awareness of, we could do this and we could do that. you know, the next step is how do you bring this to the attention of the wider institutional framework and help them to work through that? I would say that's your challenge, if I may say, rather than just theirs.
Any other comments, question? Yes, please.
I am, that's Angela, so thank you for your endorsement of the office. I really think it's a fantastic resource of youth probably going forward, and I'm not just saying it because I have the privilege to work here, but I was just on the question of resources. So my permanent secretary of vice board of the office, and agriculture, environment and rural affairs, and we've also had the support and endorsement of the DFE permanent secretary as well as the TEO permanent secretary just last week. So just my question to you, Andrew, is like, what can we as civil servants, not permanent secretary level, do to kind of maybe use that resourcing forward?
So I think showing the value that you can add and what would be needed to be added. So just like it again, just sharing with the community of civil servants that actually this is really potentially very complex road, right? Potentially problematic, and if you don't get a handle on it, get some principles established early, then the risk of some unexpected emerging, which gets picked up tactically and politically. You know, think of what a sub-editor or tabloid would with some obscure reference in an emerging regulation to say Northern Ireland will have to do this, you know, some horrible thing. The sooner those things can be identified, kept in perspective, kept, that's going to require energy and attention, and I think the wrong reaction would be for the colleagues back at Belfast to be afraid of that. We need to have the confidence that working with you, with the group here, with the contacts, with the goodwill that we've enjoyed so much lately. I think back to many events in this room, which demonstrated the disproportionate goodwill obtained by this office through just consistent hospitality, consistent networking, following a good example of colleagues in the next street, you know, in the Irish program. That's part of how it works. And so helping just build that awareness, I think that's well worth doing. You know, we can bear fruit.
I just add to that, I think it's well, too often our discussions, okay, in terms of the future, right? So one of the things, the discipline that Windsor Framework is you have to something substantive to deal with it. If I could just say reference the work of the Shared Island Unit, Department of Taoiseach and research that is commissioned for DSRI, especially in areas such as migration, integration, productivity, etc. You know, where you've really got solid, substantive data from both sides of the island, side by side, showing how that fits in the kind of both influenced by the unique conditions of the island. Now, again, I'm not saying that would immediately hit on any particular proposal of the Commission or action in the Parliament or whatever, but it's having that shared base of understanding based on data and evidence when the moment arrives. I think perhaps that's one thing, and then if there is a shared interest with the Perm Rep, then at least the conversation is starting with, you know, as I say, the managing of the day for tomorrow, and here's the data to show it. And again, drilling down through those trade figures, which you now have the data, what are the sectors, how do they feed in food and drink, you know, how does that, is there regulation? So it's not just about divergence per se, it's actually an understanding of the actual practical impact on the supply chains and the integrated production and their kind of possibilities going forward. I think for me, that's the opportunity of the framework, is that's there now, and that can be the starting point. And here the Secretariat can develop that database so that when the politicians and politics does get back engaged with it, as they must, you've got that groundwork done, that research done to help them actually take it forward from there and integrate. And could I just take this opportunity to congratulate the public for Aidan on the honour that he was receiving in Windsor today. Well earned.
Maybe on that really positive notes, congratulate you done. Look, thank you so much, everybody, for coming along today. And I'd obviously like to thank Michael for responding to Andrew's excellent paper. And just so you know, all of those of you registered by Eventbrite, an email has been sent to you with a link to Andrew's paper. And anybody else who wants to access Andrew's paper, just go on to the Centre for Cross-Borders website. It is now live. It's available for you to download, which will have a lot more detail in terms of what Andrew's views. So thank you so
Michael will
much.
polish up his paper shortly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.